It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you, Debbie, and my thanks to Braden McCormick and everyone who's had a hand in bringing me to Chicago. I'm going to read for you a mix of some new poems, which are from a book coming out next fall, next spring. It's called School of the Arts. And along with those, you will hear this and that from previous work. Is the sound level okay in the back? Can you hear? Okay. All right. If my voice drops, if things get quieter, will you wave at me, and I will get more theatrical and project further into the back of the room. Well, I want to begin with a poem that started under rather unusual circumstances. This was a commissioned poem by a British foundation that wanted to create a memorial anthology for the naturalist Rachel Carson. And Rachel Carson, many of you know, is best known for a book called Silent Spring, which was a crucial wake-up call to the hazards of pesticides and the kind of havoc being wrought upon global environments by those chemicals. The idea for this memorial was to ask contemporary poets to write a poem which engaged some aspect of natural science. And my poem is concerned in particular with flock behavior, the way that groups of creatures in flocks or swarms seem to make a decision without any apparent consultation. Suddenly, hundreds of birds turn in the same direction. How is this done? The poem is particularly interested in a flock of chickadees, which in the Northeast, and this is probably true up here in the Midwest too, are one of the few birds that stay around through the coldest part of the year. Now there's one word in this poem that I cannot read to you because it is not a word, but a sort of little explosion of punctuation. And it's intended to indicate the sound that a bird would make noticing you. If you could hear that. The poem's called Flit. Dart, an idea arcs the cold, then a clutch of related thoughts. Slim branches don't even flicker with the weight of what's landed. Animate alphabet, whizzing past our faces, a black and white hurry, as if a form of notation accompanied our walk, a little ahead of us and a bit behind. If we could see their trajectory, if their trace remained in the winter air, what a tunnel they'd figure. Skein of quick vectors above our heads, a fierce braid, improvised. Their decisions, the way one makes syntax, the way one makes poetry from syntax, unpredictable, resolving to wild regularity. Thought has to flit to describe it. Speech has to try that hurry. A scaffolding, a kind of argument about being numerous. Thread and rethread. A light. Study. We might be carrying crumbs. We're not. I wish. Their small heads cock. They lift no visible effort, as if flight were the work of the will only. Light a bit further along, and though they're silent, it seems you could hear the minute repeating registers of their attention. The here you are, yes, here you, yes. Pronoun reference unclear. Who looks at us? An aerial association of a dozen subjectivities? Or a singular self wearing this snowy afternoon 12 pair of wings? Collectivity of sparks? Sparking collectivity? Say live resides not inside feathers or skin, but in the whizzing medium. No third person. Sharp, clear globe of January. And we, the 14 of us, the thinking taking place. We is instances of alertness. Grammar, help me. Mind in the ringing day. A little of us ahead and a bit behind. And all that action barely disturbs the air. So that's from a really interesting collection called Wild Reckoning, which you can now find on the shelves. And there are new poems in it concerning natural science from Seamus Heaney and Paul Muldoon and lots of interesting people. I recommend it. I want to stay with birds for just a moment. An obsession which appears unbidden, as obsessions do, in any number of poems of mine. This one concerns the community where I live in the summer, which is Provincetown, Massachusetts. Provincetown is out at the end of Cape Cod, in the very tip. And it's one of those places of marginality, you know, like a Key West or a New Orleans, on the edge, where we sort of put things that don't seem to fit on the mainland exactly. So Provincetown for 100 years has been an artist colony, a gay and lesbian resort, a zone of difference. In my neighborhood is what used to be called a head shop. And I think that there was a period when one had to explain this term to audiences, but I think head shops are back, right? So we know what this is. All right. Think rolling papers and obscene bumper stickers, basically. This is called Private Life. Little Kaiser, the parrot in our local head shop's sidewalk cage, confronts an unceasing daily stream of whistles and coos and hellos, waspish buzz of film on auto wind, the sudden minor lightning of a flash. He doesn't seem to mind. Not a head shop exactly. Years ago, the police swept away the ranks of bongs and rolling papers, leaving behind sex toys and a universe of tie-dye arrayed beside every conceivable kind of bead. The tourists stream in search of something wild, and everyone looks at least at Kaiser's cage. He chews his parrot toys, he speaks or rocks from side to side behind a sign that reads, "I bite." He couldn't be said to be lonely. All day the world comes to him. Endless procession of faces, only a few of them known. We pass him every day. Irascible acrobat, he's half the time upside down, marvelous feet commandeering the narrow wires, or hanging from his roof, lost in thought, till he looks out and begins his coloratura tape loop of whistles, cut and paste of copycat cries. Bicycle bells, meows, squeaky brakes, a brilliant rendering of a cell phone trill, low in the throat. In the evening, he's still there, up late, clicking and preening at his oyster gleam. He is an African gray, which means his modest tail is lined beneath the tail in stunning red, a frank indulgence of the private life. Tonight it's chilly, late in the season, bedtime soon. What does Kaiser dream? Probably no original paradise. This little trooper was born in a shop. A soulmate come to him out of the daily stream? Why should he prefer a single perfect other? Maybe he'd rather give and give himself away. Maybe the pilgrim line of visitants continues in the echoing landscape of his night, one human form after another bent over him in momentary delight, while he takes their measure and mouths a limited vocabulary, all greeting and praise. Hello, pretty, howdy-do. Speech enough for our dear promiscuous singer, whose tongue lifts and curls out to the world, performing all night in his blanketed cage. When I had finished that poem, I thought that maybe I was just projecting, onto Kaiser, that maybe he really was interested in marriage after all, So I conceived this plan that I would befriend him, and I thought, if you want to befriend a parrot, what you do is you need a little sound code. So every time I walked by Kaiser's cage, I would whistle a little bit of Mozart to him, and he started to recognize me and sort of bend his head over to be scratched. And one day I did this, and there was a man standing behind the cage who looked at Kaiser and looked at me, and he said, "Kaiser, you're cheating on me." All right. Just for the sake of contrast, this is a tiny poem which I realized after it was written does exactly the same work as the poem you just heard in about 1/10 of the space. Okay? Another pet. This is a pet shop. Catalina Macaw. Dürer painted a wing like this, but only one, to imply a whole too splendid to render, or ask that we visualize what extends this fierce lemon and orient sapphire stretched toward whatever it is sublimity points to. Though Bubba's no angel, she bit out the bars of her cage. An attitude flashes in her rapidly contracting and pulsing eye, flickering dot of pupil. Are you the one whom my soul seeks? She seems to telegraph in alert and eager Morse. Are you my tireless companion, the faithful other? Pulse, ruffle of the feather shallows. No? Well then, cracker? These relationships between the human and the wordless, not necessarily the speechless, but the wordlessness of other creatures, are relationships that provide for me again and again beginning points of engagement for the imagination, as if what cannot speak asks us to, in some way, to supply language. This is a poem that began a long time ago when I was teaching at a little alternative college in Vermont, and we had a disastrous experiment at our school, but the one thing that we did that was truly marvelous was to invite students with children to come and live on the campus. And so suddenly we had little kids in the classrooms, in the hallways, and most noticeably in the cafeteria. This is called No. The children have brought their wood turtle into the dining hall because they want us to feel the power they have when they hold a house in their own hands. Want us to feel alien lacquer and the little thrill that he might, like God, show his face. He's the color of ruined wallpaper, of cognac, and he's closed, pulled in as though he'll never come out. Nothing shows but the plummy leather of the legs, his claws resembling clusters of diminutive raspberries. They know he makes night anytime he wants, so perhaps he feels at the center of everything, as they do. His age, greater than that of anyone around the table, is a room from which they are excluded, though they don't mind, since they can carry this perfect building anywhere. They love that he might poke out his old face, but doesn't. I think the children smell unopened, like unlit candles, as they heft him around the table, praise his secrecy, holding to each adult face his prayer, the single word of the shell, which is no. When that poem was published in Britain, it kicked off a sort of minor controversy, which actually was heartening to me that a poem could start a controversy, which was that there was a critic who became very upset at the line, I think the children smell unopened, like unlit candles, because he could not imagine the notion of smelling unopened. And there was a great, so there was a kind of a review attacking the poem. There were readers of the particular journal who wrote back defending the poem, and back and forth this went until the critic finally said, well, does he think he can compare anything to anything? Yeah. Perfectly willing to try, absolutely. 2 years ago now, there was a play in Provincetown. It was a one-act by a local playwright in which two characters met in the afterlife and talked about their life on Earth, so forth. And after the play, there was a panel discussion held. And the panelists were the novelist Mary Gordon, painter Helen Miranda Wilson, and myself. And our task was to talk about our ideas of the afterlife. And what startled me doing this experience was that the painter and the novelist had extremely vivid and detailed notions of what they would at least wish that heaven would be like. And I had a kind of vague, foggy luminescence. I was just shocked that my friends had so much to say and I had so little of a picture. So I began to think about how we conceive of heaven and what that says about us, how we conceive of heaven. It doesn't matter if you believe in such a thing or not, but to think about if there were such a thing for you, of what would it consist? Is it something that seems to reveal a great deal about one's character and what one's hopes. So I started to do this little series of poems, and the first of these is for the painter who was speaking that night. It's called Heaven for Helen. Helen says heaven for her would be complete immersion in physical process without self-consciousness. To be the respiration of the grass or ionized agitation just above the break of a wave. Traffic in a sunflower's 1,000 golden rooms. Images of exchange and of untrammeled nature. But if we're to become part of it all, won't our paradise also involve participation in being, say, diesel fuel, the impatience of trucks on August pavement, weird glow of service areas along the interstate at night? We'll be shiny pink egg cartons and the thick treads of burst tires along the highways in Pennsylvania. A hell we've made to accompany the given. We will join our tiresome productions, things that want to be useless forever. But that's me talking. Helen would take the greatest pleasure in being a scrap of paper, if that's what there were to experience. Perhaps that's why she's a painter, finally, to practice disappearing into her scrupulous attention, an exacting rehearsal for the larger world of things it won't be easy to love. Helen, I think, will master it, though I may not. She has practiced a long time learning to see. I have devoted myself to affirmation when I should have kept my eyes on the ground. This heaven is for the poet Stanley Kunitz, whose work I'm sure many of you know. Kunitz was twice the Poet Laureate of the U.S. Last summer he turned 98. As far as those of us who have been discussing this have been able to determine, we have not been able to think of an older poet, or rather a poet who has lived as long as Stanley has, period. Right? Galway Cannell pointed out that this is a person who, since he experienced the 20th century, we might think of Stanley as a unit of time, right? And if we do that, history becomes a much more intimate place. You know, there are 5, 6 Stanleys between us and Shakespeare. There are 30 Stanleys between us and Homer. You know, the world of literature becomes much smaller. Stanley's real achievement, though, is not his longevity, but his remarkable evolution as a poet. He's one of those extremely rare poets who got better as he got older, who became more emotionally alive, more vulnerable. You can say that of Yeats, but it's a real challenge to think of very many other people who arrive at a new kind of vulnerability late in life in their work. And when I wondered how this could be the case, I thought about his garden, which is in Provincetown. It began as a sand dune, and for the last 30 years he's been building this beautiful and eccentric space. This is called Heaven for Stanley. For his birthday, I gave Stanley a hyacinth bean, an annual, so he wouldn't have to wait for the flowers. He said, "Mark, I have just the place for it," as if he'd spent 98 years anticipating the arrival of this particular vine. I thought poetry a brace against time, the hours held up for study in a voice's cool saline. But his allegiance is not to permanent forms. His garden's all furious change, budding and rot, and then the coming up again. Why prefer any single part of the round? I don't know that he'd change a word of it. I think he could be forever pleased to participate in motion. Something opens. He writes it down. Heaven steadies and concentrates near the lavender. He's already there. I've lost heaven, another heaven. This one is for my partner, Paul. Heaven for Paul. The flight attendant said, "We have a mechanical problem with the plane, and we have contacted the FAA for advice." And then, "We will be making an emergency landing in Detroit." And then, "We will be landing at an Air Force base in Dayton because there is a long runway there and because there will be a lot of help on the ground." Her voice broke slightly on the word help, and she switched off the microphone, hung it back on its hook, turned to face those of us seated near her, and began to weep. Could the message have been more clear? Around us, people began to cry themselves, or to pray quietly, or to speak to those with whom they were traveling, saying the things that people would choose to say to one another before an impending accident of uncertain proportion. It was impossible to hear, really, the details of their conversations. It would have been wrong to try. But one understood the import of the tones of voice everywhere around us. And we turned to each other as if there should have been some profound things to be imparted, but what was to be said seemed so obvious and clear that we'd had a fine few years, that we were terrified for the fate of our own bodies and each other's, and didn't want to suffer, and could not imagine the half hour ahead of us. We were crying a little and holding each other's hands on the armrest. I was vaguely aware of a woman behind us on the aisle who was startled at the sight of two men holding hands. And I wondered how it could matter to her now, on the verge of this life. And then I wondered how it could matter to me that she was startled when I was on the verge of this life. The flight attendant instructed us in how to brace for a crash landing, to remove our glasses and shoes and put our heads down, as we did long ago in school in the old days of civil defense. We sat together quietly, and this is what amazed me. Paul, who of the two of us is the more nervous, the less steadily grounded in his own body, became completely calm. Later, he told me how he visualized his own spirit stepping from the flames and visited in his mind's picturing each person he loved and made his contact and peace with each one, and then imagined himself turning toward what came next, an unseeable ahead. For me, it wasn't like that at all. I had no internal composure, and any ideas I'd ever entertained about dying seemed merely that, speculations flown now, while my mind spiraled in a hopeless, sorrowful motion. Sure, I'd merely be that undulant fuel haze in the air over the runway, hot chemical exhaust, atomized, no idea what had happened to me, what to do next, and how much of the next life would I spend as I have how much of this one hanging around an airport. I thought of my dog and who'd care for him. No heaven for me, only the unimaginable shape of not myself. And in the chaos of that expectation, without compassion, unwilling, I couldn't think beyond my own dissolution. What was the world without me to see it? And while Paul grew increasingly radiant, the flight attendant told us it was time to crouch into the positions we had rehearsed. The plane began to descend, wobbling, and the tires screeched against the runway, burning down all but a few feet of 5 miles of asphalt before it rolled its way to a halt. We looked around. We let go the long-held breath, the sighs and exhalations. Paul exhausted from the effort of transcendence. Myself too pleased to be breathing, to be vexed with my own failure. And we were still sitting and beginning to laugh when the doors of the plane burst open and large uniformed firemen came rushing down the aisles, shouting, "Everybody off the plane, now, bring nothing with you, leave the plane immediately." Because, as we'd learned in the basement of the airplane hangar where they'd brought us, a line of tornadoes was scouring western Ohio, approaching the runway we'd fled. At this point, it seemed plain. If God intervenes in history, his intent's either to torment us or to make us laugh, or both. which is how we faced the imminence of our deaths the second time. I didn't think once about my soul as we waited in line, filing into the hangar, down into the shelter, where, after a long while, the National Guard would bring us boxes and boxes of pizza, and much later transport us in buses to complimentary hotel rooms in Cincinnati. What I could not work into that poem was that about a week later, we got a call from that airline which offered us an 800 number for counseling. So in case you're having flashbacks or anxiety attacks, call up. Okay, we're at the 2-poem mark here. It's nice to know that, so you know what lies ahead. This is a poem based on a story from the Mexican state of Chiapas. It's called Letter to God. The dogs were tired and bewildered, stunned by the ways they'd been treated by men, yelled at, kicked around, left unfed in the cold and the rain. Not to mention the usual predations: cold creak of the hips, tumor and clouded eye, ears that ceased to help at all. What could they do? To whom might they appeal? The wisest among them, that was his reputation, suggested that a letter be drafted to God. Only by appeal to a higher authority might their plight be considered. But once the questions were written, who could carry it? Who knew how to imagine the way? The ablest was chosen, a retriever, nearly incapable of flagging, and his entire being knew the imperative to carry. But how will you carry it, they asked. In my mouth. No, they cried, you'll drop it every time you bark. And then the wisest made this plan. They'd roll their plea into a scroll tightly, and their hero would open his legs and lift his tail and carry the missive inside him, where he was sure to keep it until he reached the gates of paradise. And off he trotted, head high and tail, only a slight delicacy in his walk betraying discomfort, into the fields with their blonde grasses, upstream, off toward the border of the world. Do I need to tell you he never returned? Why, Lord, the letter read, did you put a wicked clock spring in our bellies? Our eyes glaze, our old hips refuse a step. We can't even lift a leg to mark a trail. Why, given these indignities, are we further subject to the harrowing of men? We who stand before them, all expectation, why are we met with blows or worse? In every town of this world you've given us, in pen and shelter, in cellar and alley and hole in the dirt, we, your children, await your reply. Therefore, when each dog meets a stranger, it's necessary to sniff beneath the tail. Perhaps this time, this is the returning messenger. It's still possible a reply might reach them. Well, my little town, where a number of these poems are set, is a place that was particularly brutally hit by the crisis years of the AIDS epidemic, before the development of new medications that would allow people with HIV to live much longer lives. We went through a time when things seemed absolutely hopeless. There seemed to be no good news on the horizon. There seemed to be people who had grown up with faith in the power of medicine, the power of technology, found that there was nothing much for us to rely on in those days but one another. And when we could do nothing else, the thing that we would do most was to hold benefits. Many and many a night in that little place, raising funds for this and for that to try to improve at least the situation of individuals. This poem begins at one of those many evening events, and it draws its title from a song by the great German composer Kurt Weill. It's called Lost in the Stars. The Café Musicale, a benefit organized by Billy, sweet, irksome Billy, who seemed fundamentally incapable of organizing anything, though he'd managed to fill a hall, a midwinter Saturday, the town muffled by snow, and dozens ready to perform. Girl singers with severely sculptural hair, earnest poets, West End Wendy, who played cowgirl tunes on her ukulele, and a pianist who'd driven all the way from a lounge where he was appearing in Hyannis. Where did Billy find us all? The cause, PWAs, a fund for art supplies, paint and clay and darkroom chemicals. We filled the folding chairs. Act after act, the snow piled up outside, scrolling the windows with an intimate, tumbling rhythm, ethereal. Marie read poems, and Michael, in a thrift store retro ensemble that meant I want a boyfriend, made his literary debut. Someone played the spoons. David, who'd said our town averaged that year a funeral a week, did a performance piece about the unreliability of language. Someone showed slides, family snapshots tinted the colors of a bruise. Art heals, we thought. It was 1992, and we were powerless. We were studiedly casual in our clothes, which is why the drag queen who appeared at intermission startled so. A black glittery leotard, eyelashes spiking from kohl-rimmed, huge black eyes, bouffant hard and black, high, thick heels. It was a wonder she'd come out of the snow. When she took the stage, the house lights, though there were none, dimmed. The music was Kurt Weill, Lost in the Stars. Nothing overtly funny about it. Since she was irony, she did nothing ironic. Only a raised eyebrow, a subtle turn of the wrist to acknowledge the ways the limits of flesh resisted her ambitions. A long time in those lyrics before I appears, to tell us the chanteuse has wandered her way toward disenchantment. I've been walking through the night and the day, she sang, and sometimes it seems maybe God's gone away, not without a certain warmth in those tones, not without wisdom. He is unpossessed of any special understanding, daytimes, off work, but she was a contained storm, her body's darkness opening, as if one of the windows had fallen open, startling us with their continuous, scrolling free fall. Then those who'd left someone home in bed, someone not well enough to come, began to tug on scarves and coats, and the half-dozen who'd been helped to their metal chairs, canes leaning against them. Men with portals in their necks or chests for Foscarnet and Gancyclovir, who'd clapped or nodded off while we raised money for art supplies. They all went home, too. I walked into the snow. I've been walking through the night and the day. Wally was home in bed, blocks away, sleeping, I hoped, though I'd left him alone as long as I dared. I can hardly remember how it felt now, that relentless hopelessness. The musicale, in the way of such things, went on long after it was over. And the next year, there was another, though Billy'd begun to unravel then. His introductions less sensible, his imitations of his friends opaque. No one had the heart to tell him to sit down. We'd stay through it. We'd stay for Billy, and to buy the men we knew clay and brushes and sketching paper. How will I remember them? I wouldn't have guessed it would be this. How dark and glittering and strangely self-contained, she reached her gloved hand toward us. We're lost, in a gesture unmistakably twofold. She wanted to touch us, and we were already, in her lyric, contained. This is what imagination must do, isn't it? Find a form. She dazzled our estrangement. She asserted her night. She was the no one we needed. She sang the necessary, gleaming emptiness. You who are taken, you who are gone now in the drift and ash of the lyric we've made of you. Gone into the snowfall, still unreeling somewhere. Repetitive, poised, so relentless you might take it for stillness. How will we remember you? The black glove opens, and there it is, still falling, beyond memory, beyond recovery, the snow of 1992. This poem comes with a tiny little prose coda. I have a saucepan of Billy's still. He made a stew for me when Wally died. He spent a whole afternoon seasoning it. Parsley, rosemary, oregano. And Peter, at Billy's memorial, was so true to the memory of his friend, he seemed almost too exasperated to cry. As if among the 1,000 irritating things Billy would do, now he'd gone and died. And the best way to keep something of Billy was to hold on to how much he'd annoyed us. In that way, we could remember who he was.